Awesome. So I'll get started here. So hello, and thank you for attending my presentation. So my name is Stephanie Haddon. Like mentioned, I work at WorkSafe BC in our Learning and Development Services department as a full-time instructor. I started this PID program this past summer, and this is my first elective course. So my presentation today will be on how hormones, certain hormones can affect our brain and our learning. So I chose to do my presentation on this topic as I was diagnosed recently with polycystic ovarian syndrome, which is a hormone imbalance. So while it's affected different parts of my life, I've never really gave much thought to the effects it may have on my learning or my brain. I'm also currently going through IVF in vitro fertilization treatment due to my PCOS. So a lot of the information that I was researching was quite relevant to myself and what I've been going through lately. So I hope that you find some of the information in this presentation as interesting and eye-opening as I did while I was conducting my research. So before we get started, I would like to first acknowledge that I'm privileged tonight to be on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Musqueam, Tsleil-Waututh, and Tsawwassen nations. I also acknowledge that you are joining from another area of the province today, so I acknowledge those lands and their caretakers as well. So this will be an overview of my presentation tonight. I'll first discuss what hormones are, some of the different types of hormones, and then put a focus on how hormones can affect our cognitive function, and as a result of that, our learning, and then summarize some of the key takeaways at the end. So we all have something called our endocrine system, and our endocrine system is made up of several organs called glands, and these glands are located all over our body, and they create and release hormones. So hormones are chemicals that coordinate different functions in our body, and they carry messages through our blood to other organs, skins, muscles, and tissues. So hormonal messages can travel anywhere in the body via the circulatory system, and any cell receiving blood potentially can receive a hormonal message. These messages act like signals and basically tell our body what to do and when to do it. Not all cells are influenced by each and every hormone that's produced. A hormone can directly influence only cells that have specific receptors for that specific hormone. The cells that have these specific receptors are called target cells for that specific hormone. Our endocrine system continuously monitors the amounts of hormones that are going through our blood. So hormones deliver their message by locking on to those cells, and they target them and they relay the message. We have something called our pituitary gland, which senses when our hormone levels rise and tells other glands to stop producing and releasing hormones. And when hormones dip between a lower level, then the pituitary gland can instruct other glands to produce and release more hormones. This process is called homeostasis, and it works basically kind of how a thermostat would in your house. And hormones can affect nearly every process in our bodies, including metabolism, growth and development, our emotions, our mood, our feelings, fertility, sexual function, sleep, and blood pressure. So sometimes glands can create too much or not enough of a hormone, and the imbalance can cause health problems like weight gain, high blood pressure, changes in our sleep, in our mood, and our behavior, and in my case, PCOS. So many things can affect how our body releases hormones like illness, stress, and certain medications can also cause hormonal imbalances. So we also have something called neurotransmitters, and they're slightly different than hormones, but they are chemical messengers that travel between neurons and they provide communication. So some neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin, they can actually leak into our blood system and act as hormones. So both hormones and neurotransmitters influence our thoughts and our motivations, as well as our ability to learn and concentrate. So while I was doing my research, I found that scientists have discovered over 50 hormones in the human body so far. So I will not go over every single one of them in today's presentation, but I've included some on this slide that stood out to me in terms of what type of hormones can affect our learning. And while I was organizing my resources this week, I realized that I probably could have done my entire presentation on simply one of these hormones, but I was too far gone at that point. So I've included some of the key ones here. I'll touch on cortisol and testosterone a little bit more in depth throughout my presentation. But in terms of the thyroid hormone, so in the book, Hormones and the Mind, Dr. Edward Caliber explains that imbalanced thyroid hormones can cause blood flow to slow down in our brain's gray matter. And the reason that that's important to know is because our brain's gray matter is where a lot of our thinking takes place. So if our thyroid hormone is imbalanced, a person's brain becomes malnourished and it can cause that affected person to think less frequently than before. Um, Ghrelin is a stomach derived hormone that's tonically released in the bloodstream with peak concentrations in response to negative energy balance like anxiety and stress. So while normally it's called the hunger hormone because it increases our drive to eat food, it can also actually help with our memory and how we can cope in stressful situations. For oxytocin, in human research, oxytocin has inspired numerous experimental studies, which have helped examine how oxytocin can help social cognition and social decision making, which can help us have better communication skills, for example. So while I was doing my research, I came across this quote that also stood out to me. It's from Meg Cabot, who's an American novelist. So hormones are very powerful. We're helpless in their wake, meaning that it only takes a very small amount of hormones to cause big changes in our cells or even our whole bodies. So that's why too much or too little of a certain hormone can be very serious. So in hindsight, when I was reading up on all of this, everything started becoming a lot more clear, especially with what I've been experiencing with my PCOS, that of course, a lot of these changes can affect our cognitive function. And if our cognitive function is being affected, that's definitely going to affect the way that we're able to learn information as well. So that kind of brings me into my next slide here in terms of hormones and cognitive function. So from kind of what we've learned so far in the course, we know that cognitive function relates to how we can use our brain in different tasks like remembering, problem solving, and decision making. Cognitive function deficit is usually identified through neuropsychological assessments like compromised language, attention, memory, and processing speed. And this cognitive impairment can be caused by numerous factors like genetics, aging, lifestyle, the environment. But surprisingly, several studies have found that hormonal fluctuations are one of the key factors that leads to cognitive deficit and issues with cognitive function. So without our functions working properly, people can display abnormalities, which may be people may be diagnosed with certain disorders or diseases that are very serious. So prior to me doing the research for this presentation, or prior to my diagnosis with PCOS, when I thought about hormonal imbalances or hormonal issues, the things that typically come up in society is if someone's pregnant, for example, or if it's a woman going through their monthly menstrual cycle. Those are common situations where we know hormones can be fluctuated. But the more research I was doing, I was finding out that men can also be greatly affected by hormonal imbalances. So attention, memory, and spatial ability. And spatial ability is our ability to generate and retain and review visual images. Those can be key cognitive functions affected by testosterone in humans. So preliminary evidence suggests that low testosterone people may be at risk for cognitive decline, and that could lead to dementia and Alzheimer's disease as well. And so testosterone it's predominantly higher in males than females. However, it's believed to reduce cognitive performance as someone ages. So as young males are younger, their spatial ability is highly elevated because of their levels of testosterone. As they get older, that spatial ability and the testosterone declines. So that was me. That's something that I didn't know before that kind of stood out to me. That kind of leads me to my next piece here in terms of sex differences. So I was looking at some information regarding this professor called Sherry Brennenbaum, and she's a professor at of psychology at Penn State. And her studies have claimed that sexual differences can relate to hormones, and they take place very early in prenatal and early postnatal phases, which the high level of androgen is introduced in the development of the spatial ability and learning abilities. So a low level of testosterone, like I mentioned, as a male ages, can reduce cognitive function. and a review of scientific evidence about differences of hormonal effects towards different genders. Another study was taken place by a gentleman named A. Torres, who works at the University of Barcelona, and he concluded that female subjects perform better at verbal fluency, speed tasks, fine motor skills, verbal memory, verbal learning. Males, however, are better in spatial ability, mathematical problem solving, visual memory, and that boys are nearly twice as likely to suffer from dyslexia, reading difficulties, and stuttering, and that they're also 4 times more likely to suffer from autism. So another article that I was looking at as well was by someone by the name of Tuck Known, and they are a department head of human genetics at UCLA. And they mentioned that the gonadal hormones might be influenced by genetic factors, and their encoded genes in sex hormones act differently in the brain and can influence neural development and neural spatial abilities between the different genders. So while I was looking at all this research, a lot of it was eye-opening to me. However, a lot of this research was quite recent, so that there's still a lot to be done in terms of doing this and looking at this information. And due to the limited information that's available right now and the levels of hormones being studied between male and female subjects, but in conclusive, in terms of all the information I was researching, there are a lot of scientific kind of backing information. It does provide us some insight into the view of hormonal effects that are different between the two genders, especially from an earlier age. So another big thing that hormones can have effects on is our memory. So if our hormone levels are fluctuating, they can change the way our brain works with our neurons and other cells. So each brain cell can produce those neurotransmitters that I was speaking about earlier, which is those chemical or the chemicals where different information can be spread between the different cells. So if our body is not producing enough of the thyroid hormone, for example, those neurotransmitters cannot function properly, and our memory would be greatly affected. So one of the major symptoms for this is brain fog. So a lot of people can experience brain fog where they, sit at the computer, they forget what they're going to do or what email they're going to type to somebody. They forget a basic task. They suffer from just memory loss in general. They can't recall certain information that they used to remember before, for example. They don't feel as sharp as they once did, or they feel confused. So those are common signs that people may be feeling, but those could also be linked to your hormone levels fluctuating. Other symptoms of memory problems could include your spatial knowledge. So forgetting how to drive to a certain location that you've driven to many times before, issues with timelines, not remembering certain things in time, like birthdays, for example, or distracted thinking. So not being able to focus on someone that's speaking right in front of you, for example. So hormones can have dramatic or subtle effects on our memory. They can enhance or impair long-term explicit memory, as well as working memory or our emotional connection to the material that we're learning. There is also evidence that oxytocin generally weakens consolidation of explicit memory, even though it does boost social learning, like I mentioned previously. But in terms of oxytocin, again, a lot of the information I was reading was quite new, so there's still a lot of exploration that needs to be done in terms of oxytocin. Cortisol was another big hormone that stood out for me when I was doing my research, and cortisol is known as the stress hormone that we have, and that severely impacts our brain's processing as well and can be quite harmful to us. So if we are in a session, we know that sometimes if we're in stressful situations, sometimes stress can help us enhance our memory, but we also know that stress can also diminish our memory. We may choke up under pressure, not being able to remember information for an exam or a coworker or colleague's name, for example. That could be through cortisol levels as well increasing. Cortisol, like I mentioned, can affect your brain quite significantly, especially if you are under stress and under pressure. So if you're under stress and pressure, cortisol begins to grow in your blood and your levels begin to rise. And this has a negative impact on your brain and your brain's ability to function. There was one study that I looked at where there was 107 healthy medical faculty students in their second year who were going to be taking an important exam. They did a first balance measurement test and took saliva samples 40 days prior to the exam. And then on the day of the exam, they redid the balance testing as well as the salival tests. And so the previous period, the 40 days prior was called the relaxation period. And then the day of the test was called the stressful period. So when they compared the two periods of time with the data, the study showed that all the students on average, their cortisol levels had risen 9 times in the stressful situation. So that just shows kind of the impact that cortisol can have in any given situation where there's stress involved. So dysregulated cortisol is a major symptom of PCOS that I suffer with on my own. So if you add a busy schedule, work, school, everything else kind of piled into that, it can be very difficult to proactively manage your cortisol levels. So things that have helped me manage these in my life while I'm teaching and stuff like that are supplements, adequate sleep, exercise, journaling, and just learning to recognize when my mind is kind of going into stressful thinking and learning how to kind of just manage that. So I know I've been speaking mainly on negatives. However, not all hormonal effects are negative. So serotonin usually is the neurotransmitter that relates to our mood, sleep, digestion, and our overall happiness. I was looking at one study that was spanning over 2 institutions in Portugal and the United Kingdom to find that serotonin can be involved in the learning process as well. So the study concluded they had a mouse model test. So they tested the mice to see how quickly they could adapt to a certain situation. And they discovered that serotonin can play a huge role in this. So what they did is they used light to enhance serotonin for the mice. And when they enhanced the serotonin, their behavior in a situation became more flexible, and it actually boosted their brain's plasticity and their ability to learn. So when I was looking at this on a learning lens from students, not the mice model, for example. So when students are in an environment that enables them to feel secure, both physically and emotionally, they are more relaxed and they're engaged in the learning process. So if we're able to create serotonin in a natural form, it will be released in the brain. It will lead to a greater cognitive awareness and the reaction. Another study that I was looking at involved dopamine, and this also involved a mice model tested on mice, and this was to do with dopamine. So dopamine is the chemical, also can be a neurotransmitter and act as a hormone, and the chemical controls pleasure and memory in our brain. And it can be used to actually hijack motivation and increase our attention among learners. And when it's used correctly, it can actually make your learners more addicted to learning and more addicted to the course material. So again, this study was done at the University of Washington on a group of dopamine deficient mice. So they injected half of the mice with dopamine and they left the other half as is. And they provided them with a series of tasks. So the mice that were injected with the dopamine passed all the tasks easily with flying colors. The second group of mice that were deficient, they were still able to do the tasks, but it took them several attempts and the performance rates were much lower. So this concluded with learning that if dopamine's not present, it may inhibit comprehension due to the lack of motivation and memory. So again, I was trying to look at this from a learning lens in the classroom with this experiment. So if you can create a positive experience with learning, not only will the material be retained, but learners will feel more inclined and motivated to seek out that and replicate that feeling and just continue on with the learning. So ways to kind of again, do this naturally in your classroom is just through human interaction, like encouragement, positive feedback, peer recognition, opportunities for each person to kind of stand out and shine. And it's as simple as creating group activities, quizzes, like I mentioned, recognition and positive feedback. The final study that I was taking a look at involved estrogen. So estrogen is known as the female sex hormone, and it's manifested highly and expressed in the brain, mainly in the hippocampus and cerebral cortex areas, because there's two estrogen receptors in those regions. So that's why it's highly compressed in the brain. So numerous studies have confirmed that estrogen acts as a neuroprotecting agent against aging. So this can be beneficial to people, women especially, that may be at risk for dementia and Alzheimer's. Good amounts of estrogen can also help with promoting increased networking in the brain cells, increasing women's mood and boosting the amount of serotonin in their brains, and increasing the density of women's neurotransmitter receptors. So those are some positive kind of spins on some of the hormones that we may be dealing with. So in summary, hormones can influence behavior, and behavior can sometimes influence hormones. Both hormones and neurotransmitters influence our feelings and our drive, and as well as our capacity to learn and concentrate. When I was doing my research, a lot of the information and data I came across was relatively new. A lot of the studies that I was looking at that I mentioned in my presentation were like 2018 and onward. And again, we're mainly done on rodents, not people. So this topic is still being widely explored, and there's a lot more to learn. For myself personally, like I mentioned, being a full-time instructor, being enrolled in this program, going through IVF, the holidays coming up, there can be a lot, and I'm sure other people can relate in their own specific situations. I think prior to researching this topic for my presentation, I was not fully aware of the major influences hormones can have on us as humans, especially if we're looking at it from a learning lens. I was able to understand a lot more. So I know that in certain situations I can feel like burnt out or stressed out, and I think of ways to kind of help myself get through those times. But now I'm kind of looking at it more as to what's happening internally and what effects that can possibly have on my brain, and is that going to affect my capacity to learn or have memory issues kind of as I get older. And I was also interested to see kind of the studies that are being done to help enhance hormones naturally to benefit our learning. So while I know creating a positive, collaborative learning environment where learners feel safe is essential, of course, reading some of the studies that have been done regarding the science behind it was pretty fascinating. And I think it ties together a lot of the information that we've been exploring in this course so far. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you for listening to me.
Great. That was a great presentation. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
I didn't realize all the different types of hormones we have.
Yeah, there is a lot. I was when I was first looking at them, I was like, oh my goodness, there's a lot. So I tried to narrow it down more on like the ones specifically that can affect learning and kind of dive into those ones a bit more.
And what do you think causes, or do we know what causes hormone imbalance in people?
Yeah, so it can be any like there's a lot of things that can cause it. Like when I like so with my PCOS, like some people can it can be genetic or you could just get it. It could be aging, it could be certain medications that you're on that can kind of fluctuate it. So people that are experiencing hormonal imbalances, there's just so many things it could be, and a lot of it would have to be narrowed down. With me, it's with a naturopath that's kind of helped me explore different things and figure out what's happening with me internally. But yeah, it's a lot of kind of figuring out what exactly it is that's causing the imbalance.
I guess we don't really, some people don't really know they have imbalance, and
Yeah,
I
and
guess
I
they would
think
have to get tested or maybe.
yeah, that as well. Like for me as well, like I didn't know I had PCOS, but when I finally got all my testing done, I've had this since I was in elementary school. So for pretty much half of or most of my life, I've had this disorder. And now I'm like kind of when I'm reading about all these different changes in hormones and stuff like that, I'm now picking up on things like, oh, right. And like you kind of just blanket things and you're like, oh, I'm sure it's normal. I'm sure people go through this. And even
Mhm.
when I was looking at like the brain fog and stuff like that, people are like, oh yeah, like that just happens as you get older. But it could be a lot more serious than people kind of understand.
Yeah, it's interesting. The testosterone in men too, with
Yeah.
affects their can affect memory
Yeah, I had no idea about that prior to kind of looking into all of this.
and teenagers. Obviously, my daughter's coming up on that stage soon, so it'll be a
Yeah.
lot of hormones
right?
That's
And hopefully, yeah, maybe you'll understand a little bit more of it now. But yeah, it's a lot to kind of unpack, right? And like a lot of the research I was doing was quite new research, not like nothing older, like everything was 2000s plus.
mhm.
It's very interesting.
Well, thank you very much. I
Yeah,
appreciate
thank you. I'm gonna stop. I'm gonna stop pressing record so I remember. Where is that button?